April 26, 1986, 1:24 in the morning. Chernobyl nuclear power station, Ukraine. Reactor number 4 has exploded. The initial blast, a nuclear excursion, has torn through the reactor core and sent a plume of radioactive material 6 kilometers into the night sky. Firefighters are arriving at the site. Scientists are scrambling to understand what has happened. Soviet officials in Moscow are receiving reports that transform by the hour into something more catastrophic than the last. But this is not the end of the disaster. This is only the beginning. Inside the reactor, something far more dangerous is building. The explosion at Chernobyl was not a single event. The destruction of the core released enormous quantities of hydrogen gas produced by the intense heat of the exposed fuel and the reaction between molten metal and water in the reactor cavity. This hydrogen accumulated in the containment structure, trapped in the sealed building like a pressure cooker filling with invisible gas. Outside the reactor, radiation was already killing. Inside the concrete shell, the laws of chemistry were writing a second sentence of destruction. At 6:30 in the morning, 7 hours after the initial explosion, Soviet officials ordered the complete evacuation of Pripyat, the city built directly beside the reactor. 50,000 people were told they had 3 hours to leave their homes, that they might return in 3 days. They would not return for decades. Many would never return at all. But the evacuation was not motivated by immediate radiation alone. The Soviet military and the nuclear engineers understood something the public did not. Inside the reactor building, hydrogen was accumulating to dangerous levels. By 9 in the morning, the concentration had reached a threshold where the gas might spontaneously ignite. The containment structure was sealed. The reactor was dying, but the danger was multiplying. If the hydrogen in the upper levels of the reactor building reached the right concentration and encountered an ignition source, another explosion would follow. This second explosion might tear apart the containment structure entirely. Vyacheslav Ignatenko, commander of the firefighting crews at Chernobyl, understood that hydrogen was building inside the reactor. He understood that his men were fighting a fire in a building that might explode. He understood that the radiation would kill them, slowly or quickly, but that the explosion might kill them all at once. That morning, as his teams fought the graphite fire burning on the reactor roof, he made the decision to position his firefighters where they could react to the second explosion if it came. They had no protection. They had no masks that would save them from the hydrogen blast. They had only their training and their courage and their willingness to die. The second explosion came at 2:47 in the morning on April 26, 1986. It was a hydrogen explosion, not a nuclear one, but it was powerful enough to shatter windows across the facility and shake the ground for kilometers. The explosion occurred in the pressurized suppression pool beneath the reactor, where melted fuel had contacted water and created the conditions for hydrogen to form and accumulate. When the pressure reached critical levels, the hydrogen ignited. The explosion tore upward through the reactor building, punching through the upper levels and rupturing the containment structure. Radioactive debris was ejected into the atmosphere. The second explosion lasted seconds. Its consequences would last decades. The official Soviet narrative suppressed the second explosion almost completely. In the initial reports and for years afterward, Soviet authorities described only the initial nuclear excursion. The hydrogen explosion, the second catastrophe, was treated as a minor incident, a secondary effect, almost unworthy of mention. The reason was political and military. Admitting that a second explosion had occurred would be admitting that the containment structure had failed catastrophically. It would be admitting that Soviet reactor design had a fundamental flaw that could manifest in any RBMK reactor, of which the Soviet Union had many. It would be admitting that a second explosion could have destroyed everything. What saved the world from a second nuclear catastrophe was not the Soviet system, but accident and engineering margins. The explosion occurred in a location that directed most of its force downward rather than through the upper containment levels. The weather carried the radiation plume toward Finland and Scandinavia rather than toward Moscow and European Russia. The reactor's designers had built-in safety margins that proved just barely adequate to contain the secondary explosion without complete structural failure. In the weeks and months that followed, Western scientists and military analysts studied the disaster and realized that the second explosion had occurred. Soviet authorities, faced with Western knowledge, gradually acknowledged that yes, There had been an additional explosion, but it was insignificant compared to the initial nuclear excursion. The second explosion had exposed a critical flaw in the RBMK reactor design, that hydrogen could accumulate and explode under the conditions present in a loss of coolant accident. This flaw had never been acknowledged in Soviet documentation. It had never been tested. It had never been discussed in any technical conference. It had simply existed, waiting for the right conditions to manifest, hiding in the reactor like a secret the machine was keeping. 30 years later, documents released after the Soviet Union's collapse revealed the full picture of the second explosion and the fear it had generated among Soviet officials and engineers. The hydrogen explosion had come closer to destroying the continent than had been publicly acknowledged. The margins were smaller than anyone outside the Soviet system had realized. The lesson was not that Chernobyl was an accident that could not be predicted. It was that the accident, when it came, was worse than the reactor's designers had imagined, in ways they had not imagined, through mechanisms they had not acknowledged. And when the second explosion came, when the hydrogen ignited inside the sealed building and tore through the structure, only then did the Soviet Union understand the full scope of what it had built and what it had failed to prevent. The reactor had been designed without acknowledging the possibility of hydrogen accumulation. The engineers had created a machine that could fail in ways they had not imagined. The reactor had been hiding a mechanism of destruction that no one had acknowledged or tested. The second explosion proved that the machine could fail catastrophically through a pathway that had never been examined. Hydrogen could accumulate, hydrogen could ignite, and when it did, the containment structure that was supposed to protect the continent could fail completely. In the decades that followed, the lesson of Chernobyl's second explosion was not that accidents could be prevented by better engineering. The lesson was that engineers and designers create systems they do not fully understand, machines that can fail in ways they have not imagined. The second explosion was not an accident that was too extreme to foresee. It was a mechanism that had never been examined, hidden in plain sight within the reactor's design. The second explosion at Chernobyl was not the worst that could have happened. If the explosion had occurred at a slightly different point in the containment structure, if the wind had blown in a different direction, if the weather had shifted by hours, if the safety margins had been even narrower, the disaster could have been exponentially worse. The second explosion was a narrow escape, disguised as a catastrophe.